in many ways, our whole society and culture is structured on the opposite of what you're suggesting. The kinds of ways we come together frequently are with set agendas, and
yes.
I mean, even the places where we're supposed to have real dialogue, and I think of the arms negotiations and that kind of thing, it's really two agendas, and there's no real discussion of or openness to ideas and putting aside one's own position in many ways.
No, that's true. You see that we can't see it in the dialogue. We can't have these fixed agendas. It's part of our cultural tradition that there's no point in meeting unless you have some fixed purpose, and then two sides have two different purposes that can't meet, right?
I mean, it's almost like irrational to do that.
Yeah, what?
To get together without an agenda.
No, that's the only rational way. You see that if you have an agenda, then you can never explore anything new. You see that's only within the limits of your agenda, which come from your fixed assumptions, right? Now, the two sides start from different assumptions, and therefore they really have different agendas, though they claim to have the same one. And they can't meet, right? Now, you see, in these, the basic assumptions, say, behind the Russian and the Western positions cannot be discussed, right? They can only discuss some minor points about how many bombs they're going to make or not make. But see, if they could settle the basic issues between them, we wouldn't need these bombs, right? No, but they never consider that, right? Now, you see, they're defending the basic issues, right? Would never occur to them that we should really seriously discuss or dialogue about the basic issues and really see if we could get somewhere. Now, that would require, see, if you did that, there would be a kind of explosion, you see, very probably, because each one is committed to those issues. See, we had a dialogue in Israel where we were talking about things, and somebody got up and said, Zionism is getting in the way of Jewish-Arab relationships. And somebody else got up terribly disturbed and said, without Zionism, our country would go to pieces. And, he could hardly contain himself. And everybody got very excited, you see. Now, in that situation, if some people can come in who are tangentially, who are not that excited, it sort of diffuses it. You can get to look at it, right? If you have quite a few people. Whereas if you have a confrontation of a few people, one against the other, nobody can come in, you see. Now, so you sort of need quite a few different subcultures and points of view. See, if you just have West and East meeting, it'll be polarized. But if you could have intermediate points of view there, they might listen to each other. And you could start some real dialogue, which would explore the basic questions which are dividing us. Now, unless we do that, I don't see any answer to this problem. You see that we have 60,000 nuclear weapons, bombs, and could destroy everything altogether. And if you think of 1,000 years, you think people are going to hold back that long?
We have enough weapons for equivalent to 2.5 tons of TNT for every person on the Earth.
Yeah, and then consider the destruction that would do to the ecology and the climate and to everything, and as well as to human beings and to the forests and so if you say, well, for the moment the threat has receded, but time is long. You see, 1,000 years is a very short space in human history, and much less in evolution. And if you try to think of this balance going on 1,000 years, you see, so much can happen in 1,000 years. I mean, somebody crazy can get hold of these things, right? And therefore, it seems urgent to go deeper. You see, if we accept these divisions, there's no answer. You see, now in Northern Ireland, the much smaller divisions have gone on for 350 years, and there's no answer yet. Right? They can't really dialogue. Right?
So we've talked about the field of science, and now we're talking about the field of politics. This really applies to all fields and professions and institutions, doesn't it?
Yes. It applies to everything, and in principle it would apply to all human relationships, that we really should be in dialogue constantly. See, for example, in the family, as it has developed, there's very little chance for dialogue. Right? It has often been an authoritarian family, or else the family is organized around certain issues of which, keeping, biological issues, you could call them, and there's very little occasion for really dialoguing. It must be fairly rare with all that, and yet the lack of understanding between generations or between people in the same generation requires dialogue. Right? You see, the families break up. People can't talk to each other, husband and wife, and they can't. The children and the parents don't really talk to each other.
So let's say you have a group of people, say 20 people. What do you start with? Where do you start? You say we're just going to sit down and we're going to dialogue?
Well, I think I would start first. We would have to have somebody who has gone into this. Someone has to be involved in giving some sort of guidance at first. I mean, they call it facilitate or whatever. That I would start with some sort of seminar and dialogue to just discuss dialogue for a while to give people a chance to see what would be involved in it. And then we would start talking. You see, one of the advice I gave, people said, we had this seminar and dialogue, say, in a certain meeting, and at a certain stage, people said, but what shall we talk about? So I said, just forget what we've said and talk normally, you see. And they did, you see. It built up. At first, people were hesitant, but it began to build up, you see. And at first, it seemed impossible. And you see, whatever is important to you, you talk about, you see, because that's just the issue, that's just where the problem is.
So that's what you mean by people expressing meaning.
Yes, because importance is meaning, right? You see, significance, value, and purpose. And you see, people are not expressing what is their real values or what is significant to them or their real purposes. They're afraid what's going to happen. You see, that other people won't agree and they'll fight. And they keep away from it. Now that means people are superficially related.
So there's no depth and no hope for really going beyond the problem.
Yeah, you see, they can discuss particular issues, but every issue has its roots in something bigger. You see, you can't. So let's try to put it this way. We may have all sorts of groups for solving particular problems, but we need to have a group that has no particular problem, an empty space, you see. A group which, the word leisure in Greek originally meant empty space. That there's a kind of empty space where anything can go and where all this can happen.
When I was growing up, they used to talk about that we were going to have a lot more leisure time, and I think leisure time, and particularly in America, has become mostly filled with distractions.
Yes, well, I think
there really isn't any empty space.
No, people are frightened of that empty space because they're worried about what might happen there. They would like it all organized, so it'd be sure it'll be all right. But you see, but that's just the point. The dialogue is not fixed like that. It's not secure. There's a certain sense of insecurity in it, right? But if you don't have that, there's no room for creativity.
David, continuing with the process of dialogue or the idea of dialogue, there's a possibility here of creating a new kind of community, isn't there?
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, I think that if people can go into this process of dialogue and face their difference of thought and opinion and get through that, so they can look at it all together and think together, then there will be a different kind of mind. Well, first of all, I think I've said that there will be a sense of participation, a sense of fellowship, a different feeling. And there will be a liberation of intelligence. You see, this present approach, of adversarial approach of opposition, blocks intelligence. Each person is just sticking to his view, not really listening to the other one and just trying to repeating or finding new arguments or possibly finding a few points in common. But there's no real opportunity there for creative intelligence. Now, when all these special points of view are suspended, then the mind is open to moving creative intelligence. Now, therefore, it's a combination of a different feeling and a creative intelligence. So a mind in which everybody's thinking together because everybody's holding all the different points of view in suspension.
What about individual creativity in the midst of the group?
Well, each person is participating and making his contribution. You see, insofar as he responds to what's happening, then he's making a contribution. So the individual is contributing and participating, as well as partaking of the spirit of the group and of the content of the thought.
So there isn't a subordination of the individual to the group?
There should be no leader. There may have to have somebody that gets it going and gives some advice in the beginning. But the ideal thing is that he should drop away and just participate. Now, the individual is not regimented or forced to conform to the group, but rather he makes his contribution freely. But at the same time, he's not trying to overwhelm the group or dominate it, you see. That is, it's not his purpose in making a contribution to assert himself, you see, primarily.
So is there any goal for the group to achieve? Do you enter into the group dialogue with a goal?
There's no specific goal. The only goal you could say, a vague one, people must learn to talk together, right, as we've been discussing, learn to communicate and to share, right, participate in meaning. Now, but any further definition of the goal will get in the way because it means fixed assumptions. So people will have to talk without a goal. Now, as I've said, this is very foreign to our culture because people only talk for entertainment or for a useful, specific purpose. I should say that apparently something similar to this occurs in earlier forms of society, the primitive hunter-gatherer types. I mean, I read a long time ago of an anthropologist who studied American Indians. Some of them are hunter-gatherers, and they in groups of about 20 to 40. They gather in a circle frequently and constantly, and they talk apparently to no purpose and make no decisions, and they just talk. But by keeping this up, everybody seems to know what to do, you see. They may get together for certain purposes in smaller groups, but there seems to be no visible purpose to this talking other than just sharing meaning, right? And often it's very egalitarian compared with our society, and there may be, the older person may, be respected for wisdom and so on, but this anthropologist friend told me that he found that they had far more freedom there than in our society because nobody cared exactly what you thought as long as you didn't make too much of a nuisance of yourself. And you see, the thought was far freer in that sense.
How would you relate this, say, to an individual seeking therapy and being able to express themselves?
Well, it could, you see, it's a kind of therapy of society, right, of the culture. Now, say the major difficulties we have in our time, or for a long time, have been difficulties of society, which are very chaotic. You see, and in fact, most of our people who are ill mentally are probably it's primarily due to society. Most neurosis, finally, and therefore, if you merely have therapy with the individual, you're really asking him, you're accepting the assumptions of society and trying to get him to fit in. But if the assumptions of the society are themselves not really sane, then that's a very limited sort of thing to do, right? Now, you could say that we start out with people coming into the group with different subcultures and all sorts of conflicts and all the crazy assumptions of society which begin to come out. And insofar as people can face these in a friendly way, the spirit of friendship is strong enough to face the high temperature, then this begins to go, you see, and in a way, therefore, you're healing in the sense of making whole this subculture, this microculture we have here, right? So this microculture becomes a kind of new instrument of mind, which is intelligent and friendly, and perhaps compassionate.
Yeah. Where did you first start to get on to your interest in the dialogue process?
Yes, well, to a certain extent, Krishnamurti was interested in having dialogue, but it was either one-on-one or in groups, but it was primarily directed toward him, right? That he would say, let's have a dialogue, meaning not that people should answer him back, although they could, but he wasn't really inviting that, but rather that the other person would listen to Krishnamurti openly and also listen to his own response, but suspending at both, and not believing Krishnamurti or his own, and just looking at it. So, we could. That's more accurately, I think, called thinking together with Krishnamurti and yourself. Right? And now I think that's the sort of thing that would be possible on a program like this. If we have a dialogue, then people who are listening could do that, a kind of participation. Right? But the notion of dialogue on a larger scale, and what the greater objective was, greater meaning rather, was I got from a man called Dr. Patrick Demari, who lives in London, England, and he is retired now, but he was practicing there as a psychiatrist. And during the last World War, he worked for the British Army and in hospitals, and he began to work out along with what's his name? Well, his name's Fuchs, yes, a man called Fuchs, to a way of a therapy which involved large groups. In fact, they involved the whole hospital staff and doctors and patients. And after that, he began to apply it on a smaller scale, and he began to see that it had a wider significance than therapy, and he began to point in the direction which I've been describing.
Krishnamurti talked about going beyond thinking.
Yes.
And we've been talking about thought.
Yeah.
So how do you think and involve yourself with thought and go beyond thinking?
Well, you see, the first point is that through thought you get to understand, with the aid of thought anyway, you get to understand this thinking process, right? Which we also require observation. I think I've already suggested that, but I could say there's something which Krishnamurti calls meditation. Now, that word has so many meanings that it's hard to know what it will convey. But let's say roughly it means you begin by being sensitive to and aware of how your thought process is actually working. And you don't necessarily accept any of it nor reject it. It's a little bit like what we're saying about dialogue, but you suspend the thought process in the same sense and look at it and begin to see how it works and see what's going wrong. And the mere seeing of this is enough to change it. It doesn't require any further special action. To see that it makes no sense, it finishes it. And the same will happen in dialogue. To see that certain ways of responding make no sense changes them. So whereas ordinarily in ordinary affairs we have to say time is required, we have the end and the means. We project an end and we try have some means to achieve it, right? Now the crucial point Krishnamurti is saying is the change of thought will not occur that way, not through time, in the sense of time as a goal, right? That time is not the essential point, but rather intensity of perception. You see, as you begin to see the disorder in thought, it begins to drop away. Then the very act of seeing the disorder calls into play something beyond thought, which we can call, in the first instance, awareness and attention. Right? See, awareness is a kind of sensitivity to differences and similarities, which is already beyond thought. It means watchfulness, wary. And then attentiveness, the attention or attentive. It has to be unrestricted attentiveness. Our ordinary attention is restricted according to our thought. Now, in order to be able to watch thought, we have to have an unrestricted attention, because you cannot watch thought with attention that is restricted by thought. It doesn't mean you can't use thought, but you cannot be controlled by thought, or limited by thought. And so this attention will begin to feel out, the awareness and attention begin to feel out and bring out what is happening with thought, right? Now, as that dies away, then order begins to come. Because I will say order is natural, but this disorder is due to this confused process of thought, which has to come to order, right? So in bringing order about not only in thought, but in all your daily life, in which thought is heavily involved, therefore the mind begins to change. That is what Krishnamurti says, and it begins to open the door to something much greater.
So in a sense, it's getting rid of the excess baggage that we carry around from our previous existence, is that it?
Yes, it's not merely excess baggage, but it's harmful baggage. It's actually doing us harm. It's not merely that it's unnecessary.
Yeah. It's weighting us down. It's filling up our
yes,
minds.
It's occupying the mind and confusing it and leading us into destructive processes.
So we're talking about clarifying the mind.
Yes. Quite, and it becomes more silent then, open and sensitive, right?
Why is it, do you think, that most of us are afraid of that space? And it does seem to be a common characteristic.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to know. I think it's part of our culture. You see, part of our culture is to say that we have great faith in things, you see. Now, the word "thing" is an interesting derivation in Latin. The word "real." The root in Latin is "res." The word "res" means "thing," right? So reality would be all things, probably. But then that is root based on the verb "reri," R-E-R-I, to think. So at that rate, you would say things are what you could think about, right? And therefore, thought we know is very cloud. It's a vaporous, unsubstantial
Amorphous,
thing.
yes.
You can't count on it. So we say we've got to have things, right, to count on, right? And we can think about things and set them up. And we have confidence, feel secure with those things, or possessions, or houses, or whatever it is. And then, therefore, now the word "nothing" strikes terror, because you say, I don't want to be nothing, I don't want to have nothing, I better have something, right? But you see, the word "nothing" may mean just something vacuous and worthless, but it also means no thing. That is the emptiness of clarity. In the emptiness of clarity, there is no thing cluttering it up, right?
So this may be what the Buddhists talk about, the no-thingness.
Yes. Now, but you see, the whole background creates terror around that, because it's the idea of privation, of loss of everything, and suffering, and that's all connected. See, we have had such a history of all that there's a terror of removing those things on which we depend. Now, they're not trying to say you shouldn't have things such as food and shelter and so on, but we're overdoing it. Now, we are using things to create a sense of psychological security when we're actually doing ourselves a lot of harm. Right?
In your book that you co-authored with David Peat, Science, Order, and Creativity, towards the end of that book, you got into the idea of dialogue as a source of creativity, and I want to talk about that and why you feel dialogue is important. Could you just give us a description of what you see as open dialogue, the spirit of free dialogue?
Yes. Well, I mean that. The first point is, the very word dialogue, it has a root, Greek root dia, and logos. Now, logos is the word, and dia means through, not to, but through. A dialogue can be with as many people as you like, not just two, right? And and it means, what logos, I say, means refers to the meaning, right? So you get a picture of meaning flowing through or between people. Now, rather than an exchange. You see, now the word discussion has an interesting root. It's the same as percussion, concussion. It means you get the picture of a ping pong ball being batted back and forth, or perhaps several of them, if there's a large group. And the idea then is that there people are trying to make points to win, to persuade or to convince, to win, right? To defend their points of view, and so on, right? Perhaps to learn a little bit from the other person to strengthen your own point of view. But now this is contrasted with what I regard as dialogue, where if something we don't want, nobody is trying to win or trying to make his point, right? But if anybody wins, everybody wins, right? You see, if we get some point clarified, then everybody wins, right? It's everybody gains. So the point about a dialogue is, first of all, that we have this free flow. Now, you'll discover that because of our whole cultural background, this is not so easy to achieve. People feel uneasy with each other. They resist. This wish to defend your point of view is very strong, right? It's unconscious. And it comes out by people's immediate reactions. They tend to go into this discussion frame, right? Now, so the first point about dialogue is to notice that you can't just have it by will, by choosing to have it, right? It will not just come, you see. Now, you must be your deep intention to have one, but there are going to be things in the way. Now, the first thing in the way is that each person's opinion tends to be defended automatically, you see. Each person feels his opinion is right, the other person is wrong, he's a threat, and so on. You see, now, you can begin by saying we see the necessity of suspending, that is, holding back and holding in front of us our own views, as well as the views of others, right? As we don't carry out the action immediately, we are not committed to it. You see, we don't necessarily believe it. We suspend belief if we can, right? Saying we're going to look at it. But most of our opinions, we believe them, right? You see, they're beloved, as we were saying. And it's hard to do that. Now, but if people are serious and see the importance of a dialogue, then there will be a possibility of suspending this by each person. Now, if that is possible, then something new can come about, where everybody is looking at the whole thing all at once, both it's visible in the group outwardly, what is going on, and inwardly. And this will make possible a different kind of communication.
Well, let's say if we had this form of dialogue that you were talking about in the field of science, what would it look like?
Yes, well, see, let's say sometimes we do to a small extent, you see, but when people forget their own special positions or why they must defend or they must assert their views or whatever, you see. But, well, it would simply mean that people would talk freely for the sake of learning together, you see, of thinking together and learning together, and saying we don't know what's going to come out of it. We don't bring our views in there for the sake of making them win or for the sake of strengthening them, but really just to inquire.
So it would mean people would have to give up attaching to a particular position.
Yes, you will hold your position, but you can suspend it. You see, you may say, I prefer this position, but I'm able to suspend it and listen to the other. And I'm not trying to make any position win. I'm looking at them all together, right? Now, out of that may appear some new movement, which is in another direction. That would be creative.
So this is the connection of dialogue to creativity.
Yes. You see that dialogue would be a way of people participating creatively in common, right? Now, you see, if you don't have dialogue, I don't think meetings between people are going to be creative. They're going to be just attempts to make one view prevail. In other words, they tend to fix the view.
So in some way, those people who are listening to the dialogue that we're having now are carrying on the dialogue in their own way, and will take the ideas that you're expressing, that we're listening to, and integrate them in their own consciousness and move out into the world with whatever they do. Is that right?
I think the word participate is useful here. That it has two meanings. One is to partake of, and the other is to take part in. You see, now, those who are listening cannot take part in our discussion, but they can partake of it, or they can take part in so far as they go with other people, right? Or else they think it over, and so on, right? So, therefore, in a true dialogue, everybody is partaking of the whole flow of meaning, and also taking part in it, adding, doing his bit, and helping to keep it going. Now, with that spirit of participation, you could call, kind of a spirit of impersonal fellowship, right? Which, if people get to go on with it, it will become friendship, right?
This also implies a new, certainly an expanded dimension of listening, doesn't it?
Yes. Well, it means listening in this participatory way, saying, well, I'm listening. See, when you listen, you're paying attention to certain things according to your background as to what's important, right? Your values. Huh? Now, therefore, you can't listen to the whole thing, because you say the important thing is I've got to protect this idea, I've got to convince, I've got to listen to what would help me do that, right? Now, but if, in the spirit of the dialogue of thinking together, then we can listen. We have an unrestricted attention. We can listen without those restrictions.